Good morning. Welcome to CORE. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Peter Rickaby. I'm one of the directors here, and I've got the privileged task of welcoming you and opening the conference. This is our second Retrofit Live event. And it's not a sales event, and it's not an academic symposium. It's an opportunity, which we have every year, for our CORE fellows, our members of CORE, and the graduates of our Retrofit Coordinator training, and other people associated closely with CORE, to get together, to catch up, to exchange ideas, exchange news, and also to look ahead at the year that's coming, or perhaps in this case, at the 5 years that's coming. There's never been a stronger case, in my view, for CORE's existence and CORE's work. 4 years ago, Paul Roosevelt and I put together a program of technical seminars for an event at NEC called Retro Expo, which happened to be organised by David Pierpoint, who's now our chief exec here. And we organised a program of 30 technical seminars, delivered mostly by our friends and colleagues, built up over the years. And quite a few of them are here today. Many of them became the sort of backbone of what's now the CORE Fellowship, whose event this is. Alongside Retro Expo was a thing called the Green Deal Summit. Remember that? A conference attended by people in suits who were anticipating the rollout of the Green Deal and making lots of money out of the Green Deal and eco and delivering a program of national retrofit. It was quite noticeable that the two groups, my friends and colleagues doing the seminars and the guys in suits doing the summit, didn't talk to each other. There was no interaction whatever. And quite a few of my friends and colleagues said to me, those guys in suits are set to roll out a retrofit program and they don't know what they're doing. And they're going to deliver dangerous retrofit that will build in thermal bridges and build in air leakage and build in all sorts of defects for the future and give us long-term damage to the housing stock. Well, that's exactly what they're doing. 4 years on. And if you want the evidence for that, then come and hear Colin King tomorrow talking here about solid wall insulation and all the work he's been doing. Or read Chris Twins, Chris is here somewhere, read Chris Twins' evidence to the Chief Construction Advisor's solid wall insulation inquiry about how badly Smart Homes in North London did solid wall insulation to his house. So it's quite clear that doing it properly is something that the industry out there hasn't yet got its head around. About 18 months ago, at a CORE Fellowship evening, my friend John Willoughby said, we ought to stop rolling out national scale retrofit, just figure out how to do it properly, stop doing it badly, work it out properly, and then start again. And at the time, I thought John was being a bit extreme, to be perfectly honest. Actually, there are now many voices saying exactly the same thing. And it's particularly around the SWI consultation, I've heard it several times in the last month, that actually we're doing it badly, let's stop, let's sort it out, let's understand how to do it well. So the expertise of the CORE Fellowship and the expertise that CORE is collating together here is going to be central to doing it properly, to understanding how to do it properly. CORE's role is exactly as defined by John, to identify, collate, structure and disseminate best practice in retrofit. And the need for a national retrofit programme, of course, is greater than ever because we've wasted 5 years doing false starts with the Green Deal and various other things past 2030. So we have to continue to work together and we need to rise to the challenge and get it right this time. So I hope you're going to have two inspiring days here. Inspiring days here. Okay. We might be expiring at the end of it, or possibly tonight. Last year, at the end of Retrofit Live, Liz Warren, I don't know whether Liz is here today, probably not. Tomorrow, okay. Liz Warren described Retrofit Live as a group hug for the retrofit industry. And I think she was absolutely right about that. So I've got high expectations this year that we're going to have just as successful an event. Now, I was at this point going to introduce our first speaker, Bill Gething, but he's somewhere between Stoke Station and here in a taxi, and he's going to arrive rather breathless, so we've decided to make a slight change to the programme in order to give him a bit of a break, let him get in and get settled and set up. So we're going to give you an additional treat this morning. Neil May is here in the front row, and Neil is going to talk to us very briefly about ethics in retrofit. Sort of. Well, you know what happens with Neil. He'll go in the direction he wants to go. So I'm going to hand over to Neil, and we'll have Bill on the platform when he arrives. Neil.
Good morning. I quite like these gigs because I was asked 10 minutes ago to say something, and so I've got a massively good excuse if it all goes terribly wrong. But what I thought I would speak about is the moment that we are at the moment, the point we're just about to have an election. There's all this rethinking going on, as Peter's said, a sort of realisation that things haven't worked. I want to pick that apart a little bit. One of the things that that Peter mentioned was the Green Deal and the kind of obvious failure of that, which is sort of acknowledged by everyone, including the people who set it up in DEC. And one of the stories you hear about it, I'm not sure it's quite true, I think Bill Bordas told me it, was that in the construction of the Green Deal, there were 70 economists working on it and 1 building performance person. But actually, for me, it's not the building performance person that should be more of. There was no anthropologist working on it. And actually, we have this feeling that we can sort things out by getting better building performance people in there. And I think that's very mistaken, actually. And I think it's one of the things we're beginning to realise, which is this is not a technical endeavour. It's not an endeavour about getting people trained up right and everything else. That's all part of it. But actually, the increasing energy use in buildings and the increasing environmental impacts and all the other impacts are intricately related to the way that we live as people, our culture, the way that we experience buildings and the way that we use energy. There's a lot of stuff. I was at a lecture last night by an anthropologist at UCL on energy use in buildings. He says, for 30 years now, there's been this sort of reductionism in the way we think about buildings, which is that, you've got lots of different... sorry, Bill, I've taken your spot for a minute. The way we think about buildings, in the sense that you've got an economist over here, you've got a building physicist over here. No one's pulling this together, and they're not saying actually how people really use buildings and energy. So I think there's a really important moment there. One of the things that this guy called Harold Wilhite was talking about yesterday was how we completely underestimate the materiality of technology, the way that it actually affects behaviour. We think it sort of just comes in and solves problems. But actually, it completely changes not only the way that we use energy, but quite often our social situations. So he was giving an example of refrigerators in India, which not only use energy, but they've changed the whole structure of the family and social life, the way that people shop, the way that markets operate. And these things are not minor interventions. They're changing whole cultures, and then they're making people more isolated. There's often feedback loops here which create other energy uses and other problems. And we can't dissociate those things. So I think it's very important to, at the moment, to go even broader than we are at the moment, not just be thinking about how the building physicists can get this sorted out. Actually, I think they're part of the problem. I think we need to really broaden the view of what we're doing. One of the other things so I've been talking with DEC for some while about these things, and I was also there at the meeting of a GD HIF meeting some while ago in November. And I've been talking to the director who is running the eco program since there. And they also consider that to being a failure. Yes, it's done loads of buildings, but the liabilities coming out of those solid wall installations are going to be huge, and people are very concerned about that now. But what was most remarkable about these eco meetings was that the contractors and the manufacturers of insulation materials were demanding not less red tape, but more red tape. They are saying, look, we want much higher standard set. We want compliance. In fact, one of the guys from in my opinion, one of the most irresponsible companies was saying, we want 1 in 4 buildings inspected on this program because the standard is so low that we have to put in some clear compliance regulations, and government has to act as government. You know, you get this dancing around the handbags when you're at that. You know, the industry come in and think, oh, government has all the power, and the government's thing, they're thinking, the industry has all the power, and so they're continually sort of moving around each other. Just act as a government, all right? But the point is that there's a great willingness and interest from some really big companies. The big companies, one of them is sponsoring us here, to say we need to raise the bar. We need a completely different approach to regulation and compliance. So I think that's the second sort of thing to think about. And the third thing is the liability. So with the cavity wall insulation problems that have been raised in Parliament a couple of times recently, and the concerns around that, you know, I was again talking with DEC and they said, well, we think that's controllable, but we don't think the solid wall insulation thing is going to be controllable. We think the liabilities there are absolutely massive. And they suddenly realised this, like having gone this far. So I think the liability is a real driver as well for change. And then, of course, finally we have the election coming in and people making ridiculous promises about how many buildings they're going to retrofit and how many buildings they're going to build, you know. Without really understanding that these things operate within two sort of major constraints. One is the technical and the sort of skills and training constraint, but the other is the financial constraints that we're operating under. I've actually, on a slightly sideline, I've just done a paper with a woman called Miriam Morris for UCL on solving the housing crisis. And you've got all these people saying they're going to build 200,000 houses, or the Greens 500,000. I mean, and that's going to bring the price of housing down. Well, actually, it is impossible for new house building to bring the price of housing down, because if you did, house builders would go bust and you would bankrupt the economy. To make housing affordable in the UK, we have to reduce the price of houses, according to the mortgage companies and the government figures, by about 50%. Which means we would wipe 50% off the assets of this country. And we can't wipe 5% off without having a major economic crisis. So we've got this situation where that financial context dominates everything, and that really affects the retrofit market. I haven't quite worked out how, but I tell you, the asset value and the way that we're thinking about economics is massively going to affect what we do. And we're coming to a situation, certainly with affordable housing, which is the situation of mental breakdown, where the absolutely impossible becomes the absolutely necessary. And at some point, people are going to realise that this ain't working anymore. And so this is the moment that we are in. And I would encourage the fellows of CORE not to just think about technical solutions, but to think about this much wider context, to think about the way that people actually use buildings, the status they attach to this, the way that communities change, because that is the only way we're going to actually make progress in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. You get 2 professors for the price of 1, you see, this morning, so it's giving you good value right away. There now has to be a short pause while Neil's microphone gets transferred to Bill. So while we're doing that, a couple of little announcements. One is that some people have expressed interest in the building. People haven't been here before. There is a tour, I believe, at lunchtime. It is on the programme, but not many people seem to know about it. So if you're interested in the tour of the building, seeing the kilns, etc., lunchtime, have a look at the arrangements on your programme. Secondly, David Pierpoint is playing with his phone a lot, but he is paying attention. He's actually tweeting a lot from the conference. So if you want to tweet, #RetrofitLive is the one to use. And is there a Wi-Fi code? Good question.
Yes, there is. It's top row of your keyboard.
QWERTY UEL. Thank you. So, are we ready? Mm-hmm. Good. So now it's my privilege to introduce our second professor of the morning. And when I was kind of looking at preparing for today, I looked back at how long I've known Bill, now professor at University of West of England, Bristol.
Yep.
Yep. It's about 40 years, I think, Bill. So I've admired his buildings and learned a lot from his kind of quiet insights into things. So I hope we'll get a bit more of those today. Great book called Design for Climate Change. And today I think he's going to challenge us because he's going to talk about climate change and retrofit, I believe.
Yeah.
Great. Over to you then.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Okay, all right. Let's hope the technology works.
Okay, it does work. Great. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to be a bit late. Public transport's marvellous when it works, but not when it doesn't. Just refresh our memories, and I apologise. I see a number of faces in the audience who've seen this all before, probably. But anyway, I think it's always worth recapping on why we're doing this and where we are. So, if you look at global temperature over the past century or so, things start to go peculiar around 1950, and then starting to really kick up towards the end of the last century. And then we now look at future climate by using clever climate models, possibly not clever enough, climate models to project future temperature rise based on, in the UK, we use these 3 marker emissions scenarios. And as you can see, this is rather different from that by several orders of magnitude. So that's the context, and the few things to notice about this graph. That's where we are now. So we're not starting from zero. The climate has already changed. It will continue to change. Even if we stopped emitting all carbon now, the momentum in the system will take us at least to 2050. But we're not going to stop. So that's where we are now. So in order to avoid sort of catastrophic impacts of climate change, there is a general global agreement that we need to try to maintain climate change to less than 2 degrees centigrade, global climate change. There will be impacts, but above that, there'll be catastrophic, which I might come back to. So, and you'll notice that none of these graphs make it. So there's quite an interesting disconnect between government policy, which is what is driving the retrofit agenda, one might argue, and improving regulations generally, thermal regulations, is that we're trying to hit this target. And yet another part of government is sort of saying, well, we need to prepare for these kinds of futures, which is a bit of an interesting disconnect and slightly depressing, very depressing. Wouldn't it be nice to see a graph that did that, that sort of curled over? None of these graphs have even curled over at the end of this current century. So if you look at those emissions projections, these are the emissions projections through the century. I won't go into those. So in order to achieve that blue dotted line on the last graph, we need a trajectory something like that, this is from DEC, or DEFRA. And that's a 4% exponential reduction in emissions from 2016. These things always start next Thursday. It'd be great to see a bit of progress here, and perhaps we should start now. But we don't see graphs like that. That's the lifetime of a building and maybe a retrofit, 60 years, maybe an intermediate one at 30 years. And we shouldn't be talking about buildings that are slightly more sustainable, sort of at that end of the graph. We need to be designing buildings that are going to be fit for purpose at the end of their life. So people talk about sustainable buildings, but what they mean is slightly less unsustainable. And no one's actually designed a sustainable building. So that's the challenge, maybe an impossible challenge. But there are two challenges which are linked together. There's mitigation, which is trying to reduce emissions so that we limit the damage on the climate. And then there's adaptation, which is recognizing that the climate is changing and that we need to design for a different one. There's some things that we can do as building designers that tackle both agendas, like using efficient equipment, efficient lighting. You're reducing the amount of energy you're using, you're saving money, and you're reducing the heating loads on things like offices, so reducing the need to introduce cooling. And there's some things which conflict directly, and I think one of the classic examples is a push for daylighting, let's say, in schools. We get lots of BREEAM points for having lots of windows, but then the idea of that is that you save energy because you don't need to turn the lights on. But if you go to a lot of modern schools, the lights are on, the blinds are down, the ventilation's blocked, etc., and the solar gain is getting into those buildings. So you've got a sort of triple whammy of things that aren't working. So, and actually conflicting with each other. I was asked by the TSB, as they then were, Innovate UK, to help them with a program they were devising to look at the design of buildings to cope with future climate, called Design for Future Climate. And I produced this little primer, which is freely downloadable from this very handy website. But if you Google that, you'll find it. And I came up with a very sort of simplistic design agenda of 3 things: comfort, construction, and water. Comfort, generally trying to keep cool in summer. Construction, things like bits of buildings blowing off in extreme events, but also how materials will change. Materials that we are familiar with and we sort of assume behave in one way, but actually, when you look at them, they behave in a slightly odder way. The classic one is brickwork, where you sort of assume that brick walls are, well, we don't in this room, I suspect, but the less thinking people would consider brickwork to be more or less waterproof, but it obviously isn't. It absorbs moisture and releases it, and it depends on this wetting and drying cycle. And we build walls thick enough so that the water doesn't get to the inside, basically. Some walls are thicker than others. Or thinner. My house in Bath, my first house, the walls are 5 inches thick of stone, nice porous stone. As all architects do, I stripped all the plaster off the wall as soon as I moved in for some reason. And you can, actually to insulate it, in a very un-PC way, I suspect. Anyway, still there. And you could see when it rained, you could see the water actually coming through the wall. So there's those sorts of things, I'll come back to that. And then water, too much and too little, to summarise. So those are the issues. When I came to write a book looking at what people had done in the Design for Future Climate project, the overwhelming focus had been on comfort and on keeping cool in summer. So what started off life as 1 chapter became 3 chapters under those headings. So that was the issue that everyone had concentrated on. I suspect it was engineer-driven to a large extent. It's a sort of universal problem around the country, and there is information you can use in order to sort of tackle that design challenge, whereas there is less information on some of these other factors. In tackling this agenda, there is a context which we shouldn't forget. Climate change is a regional issue. It's not, the same issues do not apply in the north of Scotland as they do in the southeast corner of England. And similarly, I live halfway up a hill in Bath, so I'm not bothered particularly about sea level rise or, from a very personal point of view, or flooding from the river, which is way below me. But in some places, it's an absolutely key deal breaker. So people building houses on floodplains are unwise. And it's all about the existing stock. This is a conversion job. We talk about new building, and I'll be talking a bit about new building. Most of the Design for Future Climate projects were new buildings, but it's all about the existing stock. That's the major challenge for adaptation as well as for mitigation. And obviously, you can't just throw energy at the problem. You can't just simply say, well, if it's going to be a bit warm in summer, we'll just throw a load of air conditioning and life will be fine. Because obviously, in the future, where energy will be more expensive, and we need to tackle carbon emissions. And you can apply a number of different tactics. I'll just pick out a couple. One is timing. Climate change is an ongoing phenomenon at the moment. Some things you have to get right now. So if you're building a new building, it makes sense to get the foundations right. But there are other things where you have several bites at the cherry. So windows are sort of temporary affairs. Double glazing might last you 25, 30 years. When you replace that, and other components like servicing type components, you've got another opportunity. But when you design something, you need to design for the end of its life rather than the beginning of its life. So heating systems, you design for now. Cooling systems, you design for 30 years ahead. And the other thing is scale. You don't have to solve all problems at the scale of the individual building. It's a sort of feature of architects and designers generally that they like to they see a problem, they want to solve it in their project. There's some things it's much better to solve at a larger scale. I mean, in my view, things like rainwater harvesting is much better to do at a larger scale, maybe with a reservoir, rather than a load of useless plastic containers with pumps that break or never work, with the embodied energy that is associated with that. Not something for retrofit necessarily. So the headlines for the UK, I'm sure you're familiar with these. Hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters, more extreme events and sea level rise. And as a climate analogy, just to give a bit of context, climate scientists hate this, but if you take the summertime climate of London, by 2080, it'll be similar to, well, summertime temperatures, I should say, similar to that of Marseille today. And that puts Stoke somewhere in here, sort of Nantes or somewhere, which is obviously charming. That's a street in London, very patriotic street. That's a street in Marseille, and they're a bit different. And this is really just to point out that apart from people being more interesting in the food, more tasty, the lifestyle and built environment in a location reflects that growing together of built environment and lifestyle over thousands of years. And what we're now being faced with is converting built environments and lifestyles that are appropriate to one location and one climate, and we're trying to convert them to a different climate, and no one's done that before. I mean, in the south of France they have, or certainly used to before air conditioning, the idea of the siesta as a sort of social way of dealing with excessive temperatures. Just avoid the problem. And we could do that, and it'd be very cheap. We have daylight saving, why don't we have heat saving? So at a government level, one could do things like this. But at obviously a building individual level, you can't. Some things don't change, so that's the summer sun angle in Marseille, that's the midday summer sun angle in London. So you cannot lift solutions straight from one climate directly and transpose them to another. You need to think about things from first principles. So we're designing for unique and uncertain climates. But this again, just to reinforce the point that particularly in terms of built environment as well as individual buildings, this is a conversion job, not new build. We're not going to pull all our cities down and build Marseille. We're having to convert them. And there are all sorts of ingenious ways we can do that. There's lots of climate information in this country. We're very, very well served with climate information from the Met Office. Some would argue that it gives an impression of understanding at a detail level that is unwarranted. But this is the best information available in the world, I think. But it's presented in this probabilistic way, which I won't talk much about. But basically, instead of getting single values for projections, you get ranges of values. And this adds complexity. It makes it a bit more difficult to think about, and I'll come back to that. It's also not in a form that can be directly translated for building design. So it needs translation. And some stuff has been translated, some hasn't. And there are gaps in the information. So they don't, if there isn't a very strong correlation between climate change and an issue, the information just simply isn't there. So we have to try and deal with it. Yes, very interesting. What have I done wrong? It's stopped. It should just be moving forward. Have I broken it? Oh, it's gone. Oh, it's going mad. Right, okay, thank you, sorry. Right, this is one issue, just as an example. If you're designing a gutter, and this applies to retrofit, I mean, in Bath it's full of those lovely central gutters that get filled with, a pigeon fits exactly into an outlet. We did some work on Brighton Pavilion, which has the cleanest roof I've ever seen. It's inspected weekly because a seagull does fit exactly into a downpipe, and then these gutters overflow. But obviously, when you're doing a refurbishment, you're thinking about a whole range of things as well as improving thermal performance. And to design a gutter, you need to know about intense, short burst rainfall events. That's the crucial thing. And then, depending on the damage that a failure would do, you then use different return periods, as shown by these contours on these maps, to to set your level of safety. Climate information is, if you're lucky, hourly rainfall data, more reasonably daily rainfall. So that it's not really suitable for this kind of design. And this is all handled, the standards to handle all of this exist, but none of them, as far as I'm aware, incorporate climate change at all at the moment. This is all done by the British Standards Institute, which, despite them charging lots of money for their standards, they don't pay people anything to reassess the standards. So this is sort of amateur night. It's all done at weekends and on the train. And actually it needs a much more thorough, comprehensive go. I happened to be talking on an event where Brian Hoskins was talking, and he sidled up to me afterwards and said, well, if you add 7% per degree centigrade of temperature rise to the design criteria, you're probably about right. A hot tip. Understanding some of the problems, both in new build and in retrofit, I started to think about this, and it just started to look at comfort as in a very simplistic way. It's basically a balancing act. If you're trying to design passively, you have, if you look at recent construction, so this might be a sort of 80s house, which they all need to be retrofitted in due course, and this phenomenon is exaggerated with older houses, potentially. You're balancing losses, conduction losses through walls, ventilation losses, because we build houses that leak, so we heat up air and throw it out the window or through the walls, and the gains from people. And these arrows are roughly the right sort of size. You've got a few people in a house, a bit of equipment, and a bit of lighting. So, in order to keep warm in winter, you've got practically no solar gain in this miserable country that we live in. It's a wonderful country that we live in, I should say. So you need quite a lot of active heating to make this balance. And it gives you a heating season, September to May-ish. Now, if you start changing things, so new construction, or if you retrofit a building, and the more you do so, the more interesting it gets. The ventilation losses drop right down, and you might not even deal with ventilation. No doubt people will be talking about the link between ventilation and insulation later. The conduction losses also go down by a considerable margin. So you don't need much active heating, and that's marvellous. And your heating season reduces maybe November to March, something of that order. If you then look at summer, the same situation, the conduction losses drop, solar gain goes up, and you've got an imbalance. So why don't you just bung in a bit of active cooling? And that's what's starting to happen. And I get into trouble for saying that anyone who designs a building, a home that needs active cooling should be shot. So you don't want to do that. But you have techniques which you can use. So there are obviously some win-wins. So minimizing energy consumption of lighting equipment. And then consider the people. I mean, the things like SAP and the models we use to think about thermal comfort and sort of vaguely deal with overheating use a model where homes are particularly underpopulated, because you don't want to over-egg the input from people because you wouldn't put in a big enough heating system. In summer, the reverse is true. So you actually need to overpopulate homes to be realistic, I think. So you need to think about people. You need to control solar gains. So controlling the gains needs to be thought about. And you need lots of ventilation. We've sort of forgotten that ventilation is more than just a trickle vent. We're so busy sort of sealing buildings up and trying to concentrate on their wintertime performance, we've forgotten. And there are fashions like floor-to-ceiling glazing in award-winning homes. A patio door is not a ventilation. It's a useless form of ventilation because you have no control. And it's certainly particularly useless if you're a ground floor flat on the Westminster Bridge Road and 6 foot away are all the buses in the world going past. So, and we do this all the time. And obviously, when you start altering the performance of a building, when you're retrofitting, you need to think about all these things. You can use fabric storage, thermal mass. A lot of existing buildings have reasonable amounts of thermal mass. But again, this is an oversimplification, but people seem to think that thermal mass cools buildings. It doesn't. All it does is balance. It balances heat gains and heat losses. And if you don't get rid of the heat, all it does is build up. And you can see this when you monitor buildings, if they're not ventilated. Thermal mass that makes things worse. And there's some interesting observations, not findings, from some of the monitoring done on the Retrofit for Future projects, which surprisingly show that some thermally massive homes actually perform worse in summer than homes that have been internally insulated, which is sort of interesting. And I think it's all to do with this ventilation, lack of ventilation. Right, in climate change, add climate change into this, what that does is start to shift the balance point. So most of the year, you're actually trying to keep these buildings cool, not heat them. And the real challenge is that this is continuing to move. So it is a moving target, and it makes life difficult for us. To understand this, despite what Neil says about building physicists, I think the only tools available we have are building simulations. So certainly we need to understand what we're doing much better, and these are the only tools we have. When architects get involved and early on with building simulation, they suddenly realise there are actually quite a useful tool for understanding how your fundamental decisions about a building, the amount of light, ventilation, the sort of fundamentals of architecture, you can start to use these models to help you design better buildings. So that's one of the interesting findings of the Design for Future Climate project. Obviously, you can't do this for every individual home. So I think we need to do some clever work to understand some basic rules of thumb which would work more generally. I think that's going to be a recurring theme today. There are future weather files that you can use with building simulation tools. So these exist. The Prometheus ones are free, and they'll tailor one to anywhere you live, which again, highly dangerous actually. But you can get climate files for a huge number of locations. And CIBSE are about to, I hope, release the latest versions of the UK climate change projections shortly. The issue, and if you're starting to look at in terms of regulation, because I think this is regulating, I think governments do need to govern, and I think this is one of the areas where we need some guidance desperately. If people have the choice of using these things, they're not consistent. They all give different answers. So how do we manage that? When you are designing for a future climate, how am I doing for time? Am I all right? 5 minutes? Oh, okay, right. Deciding what climate you're designing for is a crucial issue. And CIBSE have produced these, I think, rather useful pro-clip charts, which are enable you to get an idea of how something might change, how a variable might change through the century. So this is looking at summer mean daily maximum temperature for London. They do it for all their 16 locations. There's the temperatures up the left-hand side and time across. They give you the baseline value. So the summer mean daily maximum temperature in London is somewhere around 21.5 degrees, and that's based on the baseline for 1961 to 90, so it's out of date. I'll come back to that. And then going through the century, they give you, for each emission scenario, they give you the range of values one might expect. And it's probabilistic format, so there's a central estimate, so that's as likely as not. There's a likely range, which is statistically, this is not a politician's likely, this is a hard statistical definition of likely, 33.3% to 66.6%. They love their decimal points. And then you have a very likely range, 10% to 90% likelihood. And so you can sort of say that it is very unlikely that the mean summer daily maximum temperature in London will be less than about 23.5 degrees by 2080 under this scenario. okay? And it's very unlikely to be higher than that. You can pick a range. And you see the full range of all those 3 marker emission scenarios, and that gives you a sort of broad picture of the sorts of things one might expect for that variable through the century. A few things to notice. In the 2020s, there's no, you don't need to worry about which scenario you pick because they're all the same. But the thing to notice is that the 2020 scenario is considerably above where we are now. It's a good 2 degrees above the baseline. And in a changing climate, if you're designing on the basis of historic data, so 30-year periods in the past, you are bound to be out of date by definition. So we need to be thinking forward and putting our trust in some of these projections. And we are in the 2020s now. The 2020s is the 30-year period centered on 2025. So we are in that period. So we should be using at least that projection, in my view. 2050s is a bit of difference between them, and 2080s is considerable difference, and reminding us that we need to do all we can not to be in this scenario, and we really need to be in a scenario down here somewhere. The other point to note is if you take an extreme value in the 2020s, so you're really pushing the boat out, designing for a fairly unlikely situation, and by the 2050s that's become a norm. And by the 2080s it's looking a bit iffy in terms of it's rather under-designing things. And I think, A, that's scary, but B, I think it helps simplify things. So I think it's easier to think about picking a value, picking a value and saying, how long does that value, how long is that value valid as a design criteria? So it takes all of this stuff and turns it into just an issue of time. We know where we're going, it's just how fast we get there. So I think this helps you. And quite often when you're designing buildings, you have threshold temperatures or conditions where a strategy for, say, cooling or whatever, keeping cool, runs out of steam and you need to adopt a different strategy. So you might say, well, this building will cope for things up to about there. Beyond that, we'll have to think differently. So we'll pick that as a scenario. And then we have opportunities to change. And there's no such thing as there's no such thing as climate proofing a building. People talk about it. You need a strategy for adaptation, which is over time. And you have several bites at the cherry, as I was saying earlier. These are all the climates that the Design for Future Climate, the first tranche of projects, the first 25 projects looked at. And if I take away the background, you can see in terms of temperature's up the left-hand side, a huge range of things that people looked at. Because it's down to every individual project to make up their own mind about this thing. And that's ridiculous. It's a massive waste of mental effort and angst. And it's just an opportunity for the lawyers to get involved later. So where's the consensus? And I think having done this work, we should be able to build enough consensus to make some sensible rules. So again, governments to govern. Maybe that's the slogan for this year. I think as a minimum, one should be looking at 2020s. And you can also convert these levels back to levels of global warming. So, which is a thoroughly irregular thing to do, but it sort of works, I think. So the line I drew on the last graph is roughly equivalent to the 2 degrees of global warming that we're trying to make. Now, hands up, who thinks we're going to make that? That was a rhetorical question. No hands went up, just so you know. But people were looking at scenarios above that, 3 degrees, fair enough, and 4 degrees. And people are looking up here. And it's all very exciting, because as a building physics problem, you can design buildings that will cope with this level of climate change. But if you look at between 4 and 5 degrees, London, New York, all the major coastal cities are thoroughly threatened. So actually, if we're up here, the last thing you're going to worry about is if your primary school's comfortable, because they will have gone. And so people won't be making a living out of advertising, insurance, and banking. It'll be a very different world. So it's always worth just reminding ourselves what the global consequences of our work are, or the context. Now, this is a slide that Neil gave me a long time ago, just to illustrate one of the points about construction. And this is looking at things today, and he did some work that looked at the moisture content of walls depending on the amount of insulation you put internally. It's terrible having him here. Anyway, so that's what it's like in Swansea. So obviously, the more insulation you put on, the more of a problem you have, or are likely to have. And so more care, more insulation. But location is absolutely crucial. So looking at, it's different in Liverpool, Manchester, and London. London obviously has no water. And it's also important which orientation you're facing. So these are all things that make white van man's life very tricky. And these are the people we are probably going to rely on to do a lot of this work, I think. So in Swansea, a north wall is obviously much less vulnerable than a southwest wall. And then you add climate change onto this. And there is no information, so I tried to make some up. It's something to do with levels of exposure, let's say. And this is the wind-driven rain map that BRE produced, very useful. And these are the cities, London, New York, Paris, Liverpool, and Swansea. And there's no information on future climate about wind, and there is information about rain in terms of averages, which I think is helpful because we're looking at constant wetting. So this is the current rainfall across the UK, winter rainfall, and the cities. And this is just roughly speaking rainfall in each city. So London, Liverpool, Manchester, and Swansea. And interestingly, these are transposed as compared with Neil's graph. So there's something else going on here, so this just warns you not to take this with too much belief. And there's obviously, Swansea gets twice as much rain as London. These are quite dramatic differences and are reflected in Neil's graph. So if you look at the winter rainfall in the 2050s, medium emission scenario, 50th percentile, sort of average value, there is a change, but it's not hugely significant. It's not like temperature. And so just to explain, average rainfall is projected to, annual average rainfall is projected to remain roughly the same, but the pattern will be different winter to summer, and that's our problem. But not a hugely significant change. I mean, there's a slight change. By the 2080s, there's a bit more of a change. So somewhere like Manchester is starting to get up to today's Swansea. So we do need to bear this in mind, but it's not I don't think it's a deal breaker. But what it does, it sort of emphasises this need to consider different locations as well. And of course, all of this stuff, the theory and practice differ. I'm not going to talk very much about this. This is a project that Field and Clegg, my old firm, did. One Brighton, so it's a very well insulated, built of materials, actually Neil's materials, isn't it? So it's its thermal performance is very good. Biomass boiler, all that sort of stuff. Not passive house standard, but approaching it, triple glazing, all that sort of malarkey. Small flats, single-sided ventilation. And a number of issues came up in some TSB monitoring, which indicated that these flats were overheating. And the strategy is that people open the windows to keep it cool. But there are an awful lot of windows that are patio doors. So there are some windows that you can open. So people are reluctant to open. People don't open them until it's too late. You wait till you get too hot and then you open them. When you open them, because these are triple glazed, highly sealed windows, when you open the window, it's noisy. And a bus going past, you notice. In Bath, with a rattly sash window, you don't know whether the window's open or not because it makes no difference. So it doesn't stop you opening the window, but it makes a real difference here. People don't like leaving their windows open in case it rains. They worry about security, people abseiling down the building. They worry about dirt, and they worry about their pets and children leaping out of the window. So these are all reasons why people don't behave as designers would like them to behave. And we are all people as well, so you just need to reflect about how you use your own house. This has a mechanical ventilation system with heat recovery. Are they installed right? Will they continue working? And this is particularly an issue, I think, for retrofit, because they're very difficult to design in. You need lots of thinking about, and the things that make life difficult to design them in are the things that make them work. So, in this job, if you look at the Stage C planning report, there's a nice diagram showing 6-inch insulated, solid, rigid ducts around these flats. What's installed was flexible, 4-inch plastic, the kind of thing you attach your clothes dryer to. And they didn't cut them to size, so some are a bit short, so they don't quite reach to the other end, or maybe they were gaffer taped on at some point, but they've popped off, so they're not actually connecting to anything. Some are too long, so they lie flat and are squashed. So there's an awful lot of flats where there's very little air going in. Not commissioned properly, endless commissioning sheets with lots of ticks on. Noisy, particularly when they're running hard. And this is an old system. It's similar to the system I got in my house, and it is jolly noisy when it's on. The controls are unintelligible and unresponsive. So you have a knob on the wall that just says 1, 2, 3, boost. You have no idea what that means, and the thing might make a bit more noise, but you have no idea whether it's working. It's got a summer bypass, but apparently seems to be no mechanism for making it work. And so we are delivering preheated air into these buildings in summer. The very carefully designed grills, you can't see that. Those are the grills that the air intakes and extracts. Nice dark grey, west-facing facade, nice and warm, preheat the air. And the boundary layer of buildings is much hotter than the ambient air. So these are things that we are starting to understand. These are all mistakes the Germans made, and we are going to make them too. And maintenance. These are very carefully designed, so they fit above the bathroom ceiling, behind a nice big panel. And so to get at that, in a rented flat, you have to take down this panel, which is quite heavy, with a screwdriver. And you probably have to get another screwdriver, different screwdriver, to unscrew the unit to get at the filters. So the filter's obviously never cleaned. So if one uses this kind of technology, it needs to be absolutely maintainable without a screwdriver. So it needs to be there. And you need to be able to get at it. And that has huge implications on the design of small flats. You can, of course, design double access, double frontage flats. We banned back-to-back housing many years ago because it was unfit. And someone pointed out to me that a single-sided flat is back-to-back housing. So I don't know quite why we still do it. You can't do it in Ireland. So what should we do as professionals? We can rely on Nigel. I'm slightly worried about this. This is Nigella's father, for the younger members of the audience, but he used to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he used to have much more body content, and you can see it. Anyway, that's a different point. He doesn't believe in all this stuff, so you can either say, Nigel's got it right and I don't believe in it, but he hasn't yet shown a graph of anything going the other way. So I think the professional response is, this is something that will affect our buildings, so we have a duty to understand the issue. And even if we are sceptical about it or disagree with it, you need to understand the issue, what might happen. I think we have a duty to raise the issue with the client, because we are experts in the field. And it is an issue that will affect their building, or might affect their building. There's uncertainty. So you have to raise it with the client. The client may say, I don't care, design to building regs only. And that's sort of fine. But if he does say, yes, think about it, you need to clarify the scope. This is not, you cannot climate-proof a building, so you need to understand what you're designing to and agree it with your client. If the client says, I don't care, okay, this is not a license to design unintelligently. So you will know when you design that glass penthouse under a black roof as an extension, you will know that that will overheat. And people are starting to be sued in the States for overheating, even when the client refused to pay for things that would have kept it cool. They sue the architect, not the client. The clients apparently have no responsibility here. And there is lots of guidance. There's my little guide, which is free. There's the book, which isn't free, but excellent value. And there's, I'm not aware of a book that covers climate change for domestic refurbishment, but this book, which I did a chapter for, does cover climate change. And a lot of it, I think, is applicable to domestic refurbishment, and not in the detail you're going to discuss here today. And that's it. Thank you very much. I've got time for questions? Yeah, fine. Yeah.
Very slightly into your break, if that's all right.
But you may want coffee. Oh, gosh.
Yeah, Bill, you didn't say anything about winter time in the future, and there are people out there who are saying you can relax sort of insulation standards because of future climate. So can you say something about that?
It is true that generally speaking it will warm in winter, and actually things like the urban heat island are great in winter because they do reduce heating. But I think we can also safely say that there will be extremes of weather. And you have to design a heating system for the beginning of the period anyway, and a cooling system for the end of the period. So there's no point in relaxing standards now on the off chance that it may get better later. So I think we still have to deal with the peaks and troughs. So I don't think that's an argument. And you know, if you're a real doom monger, you'll get a flip in the climate anyway, which day. But if you get that, you can relax, actually. Let's not go there.
There was a short statement within an interview on national radio, I think it was last week or the week before, by some expert, whose name I've forgotten. I think he was American. But either way, he was put up on the radio as being a tip-top expert on climate change. He said, it's too late. There's no point in improving energy efficiency strategies because we've already got overheating. We need to adapt instead.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. The guy who talked about Gaia, I think. Lovelock. Yes, I suspect it was him. He wants a nuclear power station, a nuclear reactor in his garden. That's how he's going to keep him warm. We certainly need to adapt, but to ignore what we could do to reduce the damage, I think that seems to me irresponsible. So I think we can do something, and we need to do it. It's a two-pronged attack. So I would disagree with him. I think he also said that Britain's one of the nicest places, going to be one of the best places in this future, which is true. But why wouldn't everyone want to come here? You know, these are big issues. So I think adopting that stance would not be sensible.
One more here.
Every time somebody tries to do something to address the issue, the government says, yes, we'll do this, and then when it comes to it, they back down. They do it every time, and they've been doing it for the last 30 years. Every time the government promises to improve the building regulations, when they actually improve the building regulations, the building industry lobbies the government hard and makes them dilute the standards.
Yeah.
So we're riding a horse race where they keep lifting the bloody height of the hurdles.
Yeah.
You know, we're battling. We're almost battling against ourselves because it's our industry, our construction industry, that is stopping us from doing it any better.
Yeah.
If
No,
we
I
just put the building regs up to passive house standards 20 years ago, we won't be in this bloody mess.
yes. Not sure whether that would have been the answer. But anyway, no, I agree. You've identified the problem. And I think done a report on the business case for adaptation. And it's going to be launched in June, I think. But to save you reading it, there isn't one. So and that's tricky for government. But I think this agenda, and to a large extent the mitigation agenda too, is driven by, is unfashionable to talk about it, but by catastrophic events. You need events that make us think. Now, if were the floods last year could have been a trigger event, I think they probably were. And certainly, if you look at adaptation conferences since then, it's all been about flooding. And if you look at research money, it's all going into flooding. My own university does lots of work on it. And somehow it's those things that bring us up short. So, and the only things, again, I get into trouble for talking about these things, but
So do I.
but you know, the summer of 2003, it killed a lot of people. Not as many as get killed in winter. You know, we're very selective about what we think. But it's clearly, when I started thinking about this, lobbying government to change, you know, to bring in regulation about overheating, there are 3 crappy summers. You can't bring in legislation under those things, under those circumstances. So I think you have to prepare and have answers ready for those events. So I think that's what the game we're in, probably. And also demonstrate other gains. You know, that's the other thing. I mean, it is possible. I think there's going to be a lot of talk today about the problems of retrofit, but it is possible to retrofit a home and make life wonderful. Let's do that.
Can we take one more for the break? Andrew, you have a question, have you?
Yes, I was interested with the
Sorry. Hi.
with the talk about overheating and some of the adaptation bills. And the focus we've got with existing stock, which is where I see the major problem, is about air tightness and insulating to reduce energy use. And I wondered if we're at a stage now where we should be perhaps considering the other factors as to where the balance is between getting it right for winter and getting it right for summer, getting it right for dry, getting it right for wet.
Yeah, no, I think we are. And there are occasional sort of snippets in government edicts that do say we must balance and watch overheating. But I think it is a change of mindset. It's making sure that with the easy things we can do to buildings, like what people have habitually done is, you know, gum up the windows. I don't need this window to open. I'll gum it up, and then it doesn't. You know, it's no longer a problem. Well, it can be a problem. So you just need to think about it.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.
That was great. We need to move on. So.